Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are undertaking a uniquely challenging deep dive, and I have to say this might be one of the most intense and provocative sets of material we've ever worked with.
It's definitely heavy. We're looking at a collection of sources that offer an unflinching critique of a really significant, very visible and politically powerful segment of contemporary American evangelicalism.
And when you say critique, it feels like an understatement. These documents, one is literally titled an indictment, and there are these other structured theological reports. They don't just comment on things. They're trying to make a diagnosis.
That's the perfect word for it, a diagnosis. And their main analytical tool, the lens they use for this diagnosis, is biblical prophecy. They're using these ancient patterns to argue that a major part of the American church has, well, it's fundamentally betrayed its core mission.
Betrayed its mission.
Yeah.
Okay, so the sources are framing this as a full-blown identity crisis, right? It's not just a few mistakes. They're saying the church has completely lost the plot.
It's the crux of the whole argument. The sources contend that the church, in its biblical design, was meant to be an embassy of the kingdom of Christ.
An embassy. I like that image.
Right. Think about what that means, a foreign ministry. It speaks on behalf of a sovereign king, a king whose kingdom is explicitly not of this world. Its job is to offer truth, challenge, and a different way of being to the host country, in this case, America.
It's supposed to be the ultimate countercultural presence, a little piece of different kingdom right in the middle of the empire.
Exactly. But the critique is that it has devolved. It has functionally traded that powerful, independent role of ambassador for the role of the court prophet.
Ah, the court prophet.
Yeah.
The one who tells the king what he wants to hear.
Precisely. It stopped speaking truth to power and has instead started speaking for power, providing a kind of religious sanction, applause, cheerleading for American nationalist goals, for its power structures, for its wealth. It's become an affirmation of the state.
Instead of a prophetic challenge to it.
Yes, and it's a huge distinction. You're trading the spiritual authority of an embassy for a comfortable familiarity of being a fixture in the court.
And the source material we're synthesizing today is designed to be provocative, to really push buttons. It compares what's happening now directly to ancient Israel's own documented history of, self-deception and collapse.
So our mission today is pretty clear. We have to explore the specific mechanisms the sources identify. How has this preference for comfort, for simulation, and for silence been built and maintained?
Because the sources call those things comfort, simulation, silence, the final sacraments of the lie. That's a heavy phrase.
It is, and we have to examine the evidence they present across three key areas.
Yeah.
First, this idea of psychological escape through simulation. Second, the moral trade-offs in political alliances. They have a really sharp name for that. And third, the consequences in foreign policy, specifically looking at Christian Zionism and the crisis in Gaza.
And as always, just to be crystal clear for you listening, our job here is to remain impartial. We are reporting only on the critique and the arguments contained within these specific sources we've been given.
That's the only way to approach something this sharp. We're analyzing the argument, not making it ourselves.
Okay, let's jump straight into the foundational concept then. It's the one the sources use to frame the entire problem. It's a central, very visual, and frankly, an unforgettable metaphor. They call it the VR headset metaphor, simulation versus screams.
Yeah, this one sticks with you. It's designed to be instantly relatable to our current moment. The scenario they paint is of a figure, a privileged, tech-savvy girl. She kind of symbolizes first-world optimism, technological progress, curated media narratives.
The perfect picture of modern comfort.
Exactly. And she's holding a sleek, new VR headset. In the illustration, she thrusts this headset onto the head of an impoverished, gaunt-looking boy.
And inside that headset, what is he seeing? What's the vision she's offering?
She's giving him a vision of augmented virtual abundance. Inside this high-fidelity simulation, everything is beautiful, it's restored, peaceful, abundant. Her voice, it's echoing through the digital audio with the pitch. Isn't it all so beautiful? Isn't this the restoration we've all been working for?
So it's a perfect, digitalized, nationalist, and ultimately a comfortable vision. The dream of a nation restored.
It's the dream. But the boy, who is still physically present in his poverty, he provides the prophetic indictment that just shatters the whole thing.
What does he say?
His only response, delivered right through the virtual reality of the headset, it just cuts through that digital dream. He just says, yes, but I'm still hungry.
Wow. I'm still hungry.
Yeah. And the sources emphasize the details in the background of the cartoon. The boy's actual reality, a tattered hut, barren ground, very evident material suffering, none of that is erased by this beautiful virtual overlay.
So the girl might even be well-intentioned. The sources aren't necessarily saying she's malicious, are they?
That's a really crucial nuance they make. The girl, who could represent a well-meaning church faction or a political movement or even just the whole apparatus of high-production media, she genuinely believes she is sharing hope, a vision of victory.
She thinks she's helping.
She thinks she's helping. But the critique states that her well-meaning action results in this profound failure of perception. The headset, as beautiful as it is really just a sophisticated blindfold. It's designed to alleviate her discomfort about the world's suffering, not his actual suffering.
It was a beautiful diversion that leaves the stomach growling.
That's exactly. And this analogy is then immediately and very pointedly applied to the massive, highly visible activities of the contemporary American church. The sources labeled this whole phenomenon the simulated triumph.
The simulated triumph. Okay, let's dig into that. How does that metaphor become a tool for analysis?
Well, the sources argue that the American evangelical ecosystem has perfected what they call an extraordinarily sophisticated apparatus for generating and sustaining the illusion of spiritual triumph.
An illusion machine, basically.
An illusion machine. It's an internal media machine that is constantly affirming that God is blessing America, that the church is winning the culture war, that revival is just around the corner.
So how does this sophisticated apparatus actually manifest? I mean, in practical terms, you can just think of the sheer scale of some of these modern mega ministries and events.
Oh, they cite very specific practical examples. This isn't just about what's being preached, it's about the presentation. They point directly to massive stadium events where the emotional intensity is deliberately maximized by high production values.
Right, the huge LED walls, the professional lighting, the sound system.
Exactly. Sound that often just grounds out any kind of reflective, critical thought. And these events, they almost always feature these extended, very highly emotional altar calls.
And then that experience, that peak emotional moment, is distilled and recirculated through social media.
That's the second part of the machine. It's paired with strategically viral social media clips. The sources suggest these clips are meticulously edited to maximize the emotional impact. You know the ones we're talking about.
The God is Moving in America reels.
Those are the ones. They're designed not just to report on revival, but to generate the feeling of revival in the viewer. The argument is that this whole apparatus operates as a virtual reality machine for spiritual experience, selling the illusion of immediate national restoration.
So here's the key question for me. If the experience feels sincere, and the sources even concede that the worship is often genuinely heartfelt, how does this machine fundamentally turn that sincerity into a lie?
This is a fascinating point in the analysis. The sources identify the mechanism not as a deceit of the heart, but as a deceit of selective narrative.
A selective narrative.
Yes. The machine is built with, and this is a quote, LED walls that pulse like heaven while hell rages outside the doors. The lie isn't that the pulsing walls are beautiful. The lie is that you believe the pulsing walls are the reality.
So you're focusing on the simulation so you don't have to look at the screams.
That's it. The narrative constantly talks about awakening, restoration, victory, but it systematically excludes the prophetic data that God has placed right in front of the church. Data about persistent, embodied suffering, systemic injustice, national moral failure.
So the simulation's primary job is to create a psychological and spiritual immersion that just blocks out the reality. Yeah. That's the boy saying, I'm still hungry.
Yes. And the sources argue that when you prioritize this beautiful, augmented nationalist vision, you risk this subtle exile and dehumanization of the poor, the marginalized, the suffering. They stop being real people with theological importance and become, at best, what? Data points for your church's charity dashboard.
Just numbers on a screen.
Just numbers. So the boy's refusal to surrender his reality, I'm still hungry, that is the core prophetic refusal. It's the refusal to be co-opted by the beautiful lie.
The core critique then really boils down to this. The worship is often sincere, the desire for God can be real, but the environment created around it, the headset, it never fills the stomach. It serves the powerful who need comfort, not the poor who need justice.
Well,
the sources state it very plainly. The lie isn't that everything looks beautiful in the simulation. The real lie is that you believe it is real, and therefore you do not look at the actual hunger right outside the stadium. It is the acceptance of the illusion as reality that facilitates the betrayal of the mission.
It's a chilling insight, and this connects us directly to the historical framework. The sources are arguing that this modern high-tech simulation isn't new at all. It's just a recurrence of a cycle that has plagued the people of God for millennia.
Absolutely. What's so compelling here is that the sources treat this modern simulation not as some novelty of the internet age, but as a direct repetition of a well-documented ancient pattern. This recurring syndrome, they say, is the preferred response of a religious leadership class that is facing impending accountability.
Covenant judgment, they call it.
Covenant judgment, yes.
Okay, let's clarify the theological underpinning here first. What is the covenant being violated that leads to the need for these comforting illusions in the first place?
So the sources ground their entire argument in that covenantal tradition, the contract between God and ancient Israel. When the prophets spoke of judgment, they were referring to the consequences that were literally laid out in the law, in Deuteronomy, for national covenant unfaithfulness.
And that unfaithfulness wasn't just like personal sin, it was bigger.
Oh, much bigger. It primarily manifested as social injustice, economic oppression of the poor, and idolatry, often the idolatry of the nation itself. The leaders knew they were in trouble, but instead of repentance and restitution, which is costly, they sought a shortcut, a religious affirmation that everything was fine.
They didn't want the costly truth, they wanted the comfortable illusion.
Exactly. The sources reference this biblical demand for smooth things. It's from Isaiah 30, and the people's demand was explicit. It was cynical. They said, "Do not prophesy to us what is right. Speak to us smooth things. Prophesy illusions."
Wow, they actually asked for illusions.
They asked for it. They didn't want justice. They wanted political and economic reassurance, all dressed up in a religious language. In the language of the modern critique, they were demanding, just let us enjoy the simulation. Don't break the immersion with all this talk of poverty or exile.
Let's deepen this by looking at the case studies the sources rely on. The first one is foundational for this critique. The confrontation between the prophet Micaiah and the 400 court prophets in 1 Kings 22.
This story perfectly illustrates the dynamic of the court prophet. You have King Ahab of Israel, and he wants to go to war to reclaim some territory from the Arameans. So he gathers his 400 official state-sponsored prophets.
He's basically asking his cabinet of religious advisors to focus group his foreign policy.
That's a great way to put it. And all 400 of them enthusiastically promise a guaranteed win. They use the language of divine favor. Go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king. This is the ultimate message of illusory peace and national blessing.
But there's another king there, Jehoshaphat, and he senses that this overwhelming consensus is suspicious.
He does. He asks, "Is there not here another prophet of the Lord of whom we may inquire?" And Ahab admits with just open contempt that there's this one guy, Micaiah, whom he hates because, quote, "he never prophesies good concerning me, but evil."
So Ahab knows. He understands that the price of truth is that it always indicts his personal choices and his state policies.
He knows, and when Micaiah finally appears, he at first offers this sarcastic, mocking agreement with the other 400, go up in triumph. But when Ahab presses him to tell the truth, he reveals the real, uncomfortable vision.
The anti-simulars.
The ultimate anti-simulation. He says God's judgment is already set. He sees a vision of Israel scattered like sheep without a shepherd because Ahab is going to die in that battle. The court prophets offer victory. The true prophet offers death and defeat.
And the sources note that the immediate reaction to this truth was physical violence, which just underscores the stakes.
It does. Zedekiah, who is the leader of the 400 false prophets, he walks up and physically strikes Micaiah on the cheek. And he asks, "In what way did the Spirit of the Lord go from me to speak to you?" The act itself symbolizes the violence that's required to suppress prophetic truth.
And Ahab, predictably, doesn't listen.
He throws Micaiah in prison on a diet of bread of affliction and water of affliction, basically a starvation diet, ordering him to be kept there until he returns victorious. Of course, he never does.
And the outcome confirms the prophetic truth.
Ahab dies in battle, just as Micaiah said. The comforting illusion of victory collapses into a national catastrophe. The sources stress that the false prophets offered military peace, a promise of political security, which is the ancient equivalent of the modern VR promise of national prosperity and triumph.
They provided this spiritual validation for a self-destructive foreign policy.
And we see this exact same pattern repeating centuries later with Jeremiah and Hananiah. This shows it wasn't just an isolated incident, but a systemic problem with the leadership class.
All right, this is just before the final collapse of Jerusalem. Jeremiah is delivering this incredibly difficult message.
The most difficult. He's saying judgment is coming via Babylon. Surrender is the only option. You have to endure the exile. And to symbolize this, he's wearing a wooden yoke on his shoulders in public. This is the costly truth. Things are going to get much worse before they get better.
And Hananiah comes along and offers the preferred, smoother version of reality.
Hananiah stages this dramatic counter-prophecy. He walks up to Jeremiah in the temple in front of everyone, and he physically breaks the wooden yoke off his shoulders. And he declares that God will break the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar within 2 years.
So immediate political deliverance, swift national restoration.
The exact message the temple priests and the political elites desperately wanted to hear. It affirmed that their nationalism was blessed by God and their suffering would be brief.
And what was the specific indictment against Hananiah's kind of prophecy?
The indictment, which the sources reference from Jeremiah 23, is profound. It says that Hananiah and his guild speak a vision of their own hearts. They aren't speaking for God. They are projecting their own desires, their own nationalism, their own political preferences onto God, and then selling it back to the people as divine truth.
It's a tailor-made spiritual placebo.
It is, and the consequence for preferring that flattering vision, the virtual garden of immediate restoration.
Hananiah dies within 2 months, and Jerusalem is destroyed in 587 BCE.
Yes. The sources are drawing a direct line between these historical outcomes. Prioritizing the comforting illusion leads directly to national collapse and, crucially, unchanged suffering. The historical lesson is clear. The prophet who sells peace when there is no peace is actually selling the people into exile.
So it seems the essential theological synthesis the sources are offering is that this failure always stems from a root idolatry.
Yes. The theological root of the modern VR illusion is the idolatry of self, or the idolatry of the nation, masked as piety. The true prophets were focused on justice, righteousness, truth-telling. The kings and the court prophets preferred military alliances, economic prosperity, and ritual observance, anything that didn't demand a fundamental change in their behavior or their power structures.
The court prophets just gave them the spiritual permission slip they needed to keep doing what they were doing.
That's it. And that deep historical foundation makes the modern political and moral critique so much heavier. If the American church has adopted the court prophet's role, then where do we find the modern equivalent of the smooth things they're demanding?
Well, this is where we transition from the general metaphor to the specific political and moral realities that the VR headset is designed to hide. This is where the price of American greatness is calculated in moral currency.
And this is where it gets really interesting, and for many people, I think, quite difficult to hear. The sources dedicate a significant amount of space to what they call case study I, the functional canonization of a political figure and the Epstein-class moral vacuum.
The functional canonization. That's a loaded term.
It's meant to be. The sources argue that this is the modern transactional fulfillment of that court prophet role. The goal is the desired political outcome, American greatness, the restoration of a certain social order. And the cost is the total abandonment of prophetic moral standards, specifically around the behavior of the political figure who delivers those outcomes.
Okay, let's be very specific about the moral vacuum the sources identify. The material is explicit about the documented evidence that they claim vast segments of the evangelical world have chosen to completely ignore.
They are very deliberate here. They emphasize that these are facts from the public record, presented as no longer seriously contestable. The material lists documented allegations and facts that relate to what they term the Epstein-class corruption at the heart of American power.
And this includes
It includes multiple flights on the Lolita Express, Trump's own recorded statement about liking women on the younger side, wishing Ghislaine Maxwell well on camera after her arrest, the 2016 tape of him boasting about sexual assault, and multiple credible accusations of sexual misconduct that have been affirmed by the courts.
And the sources stress that their critique isn't about debating the validity of these public facts. It's about the church's organized response to them.
Precisely. The core of the indictment is what they call the hermeneutic of silence.
A hermeneutic of silence. So a strategy of interpretation based on not saying anything.
Exactly. They observe that these deeply uncomfortable documented facts are not debated or defended by vast swaths of the evangelical world. They are simply never mentioned. The mechanism is a deliberate strategic omission. It's an internal, unspoken consensus to just treat the information as if it doesn't exist, and by doing so, giving the political figure a kind of functional moral immunity.
This highlights a massive double standard that we have to explore. We're talking about a dramatic, almost 180-degree shift in moral concern over the course of a generation.
This is the most stinging rhetorical point in the material. The sources point directly to the historical record. Pastors who, in the 1990s, preached entire thunderous sermon series on Bill Clinton's infidelity, characterizing it as a deep moral crisis that threatened the very soul of the nation, have now adopted this new hermeneutic silence.
The same pulpits that thundered character matters.
The very same ones. Now, they treat similar or, by many metrics, worse documented behavior as completely irrelevant or simply non-existent.
And the sources argue that this silence isn't just a sign of political pragmatism. It's a theological concession.
They define it as consecration to the lie. It's a transaction. The political figure delivers specific, desired policy outcomes, and this is vital. The sources specifically cite successful conservative judicial appointments and robust policies protecting religious liberty.
Things seen as the ultimate victory in the culture war.
The ultimate victory. And that payoff is received in exchange for a religious sanction, which is provided through this deliberate, widespread moral omission.
So the church sacrifices its prophetic moral voice in the public square to achieve its political goals. The political figure delivers the national restoration vision, the VR headset, and the church pays the price in moral currency.
That is the exact conclusion drawn. The church is sacrificing its ambassadorship, the requirement to stand for justice and righteousness no matter who is in power, for the short-term benefit of being the court prophet. They argue the cost of American greatness is treating Jesus' actual commands about purity, compassion, and truth-telling as, optional.
And they summarize his betrayal very sharply, connecting it directly back to the idea of the kingdom.
Yes, they accuse this segment of the church directly. You declare Jesus as king, and then treat his words about the least of these, or his words about the moral requirements of leadership, as optional footnotes to your real gospel, American greatness.
So the collective refusal to see the moral compromise, the refusal to even acknowledge the Epstein-class corruption because the figure is politically useful, that is the political VR headset.
It's the ultimate political VR headset. And the most powerful element of this section is the argument that believers don't even fully believe their own lie, which is proven in their private lives.
This is where the critique tries to shatter the cognitive dissonance.
It does. They list instances of personal integrity that stand in stark contrast to the public silence. They argue, when your own daughters were assaulted, you believed them. When your own families needed Medicaid or food stamps, you quietly used the government help. When your own teenagers were groomed online, you raged with righteous anger.
They applied a robust moral standard when their own family was on the line, but they just jettisoned it for the powerful political figure.
Yes. The logic is that they know the difference between right and wrong, between justice and corruption, when their own immediate self-interest or family is at stake. But they abandon that standard for the political figure who promises them a restored nation.
So the sources argue this proves the silence isn't from some deep theological conviction.
It's a pragmatic transaction. The church, instead of crying out against the system's moral rot, becomes the system's most important shield.
The silence, therefore, is not neutral. It is the engine.
Silence is the oil that keeps the machine running. That is the exact phrase the sources use. It ensures that the moral vacuum at the heart of American power remains filled by the strategic loyalty of a major religious bloc.
Okay, now we have to shift gears completely, moving from domestic political compromise to the international sphere. This is where the sources level an equally severe indictment. It's case study the second, Christian Zionism and the collapse of prophetic credibility. And this centers very heavily on the role of theology in shaping the church's response to the crisis in Gaza.
This case study examines how a specific, very influential theological framework, Christian Zionism, when it's merged with American national identity, dictates not just what the church says about global events, but what it becomes constitutionally incapable of saying. And the sources acknowledge just how saturated American evangelical platforms are with this influence.
So what is the theological framework that the sources identify as the root cause of this failure?
The material points specifically to dispensationalism. For roughly 70 years, this school of thought has taught that the modern state of Israel is the primary fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And crucially, the mandate for Christians to bless Israel, which is derived from Genesis 12.3, has been interpreted almost exclusively as requiring unconditional political, diplomatic, and military support for the modern state.
And the sources find that this theological priority fundamentally displaces Christ's own explicit teachings on justice and caring for the poor.
They draw a very, very sharp contrast. They observe that generations of believers have been trained to, quote, Genesis 12.3, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. as a political mandate more readily and more often than Matthew 5, where Jesus details the judgment of nations based on how they treat the least of these.
So the sources are arguing this prioritization is a fundamental theological betrayal. It's replacing the gospel of embodied mercy with a gospel of geopolitical strategy.
And the theological VR headset in this case is labeled Genesis 12.3. It acts as an optical filter. It allows a segment of the church to view this modern geopolitical conflict through a single lens of eschatological fulfillment and political loyalty, which then blocks out the immediate, visceral human suffering.
And this framework, they argue, shaped the massive silence that followed the events of October 7, 2023, and the subsequent military campaign in Gaza.
The sources detail the scale of that military action, citing data from various human rights organizations. They characterize the response as involving disproportionate collective punishment, the destruction of 70 to 80% of Gaza's housing, the killing of over 43,000 Palestinians, the majority women and children.
And they also mention the targeting of hospitals, schools, and the blocking of aid convoys.
Yes. They characterize it as a conflict that turned what was already an incredibly difficult place into, quote, the world's largest, most visible graveyard.
And the core critique is the massive prophetic vacuum that met this humanitarian catastrophe within the American church.
The silence was, as they describe it, total and institutional. There were no national calls for fasting and repentance over America's foreign policy entanglement in this violence. There were no major denominational statements naming the suffering of Palestinian civilians. No major prophetic conferences suggested that an interpretation of unconditional blessing might need to be re-examined when confronted with documented war crimes and such immense civilian casualties.
So instead of lament or a prophetic warning, the simulation just kept running.
Exactly. They point out this damning contrast. While this suffering was escalating, the same prominent Christian platforms were continuing to live stream their stadium revivals, speaking of God's end-time plan, and billion-soul harvests, and in doing so, ensuring the cries of 2 million displaced and starving Palestinians were treated as just background noise to the sound of their victory choruses.
The sources argue that a prophetic theology that claims to care so deeply about what God is doing in history went completely silent on the most profound global human catastrophe of the year.
Because it implicated their political and theological allies.
Yes.
And they redefined the silence. It's not passive neutrality, it's an active compliance with the machine of power.
This is the fierce indictment that you just have to let sit for a moment. The sources argue that the silence is an aggressive act of loyalty to the state and to the nationalist project. They declare, every Sunday you do not speak as a votecast. And then, every worship set that never mentions the genocide is a covering prayer. And the most provocative statement the sources make in this entire section.
It's aimed directly at the concept of national blessing being intertwined with military action. It says, every God bless America that never repents have mercy on us for what we are doing in Gaza is a benediction over child murder.
That is incredibly harsh.
It's meant to be. The sources insist that the church's financial and theological support for this political and military alignment is the modern equivalent of the court prophet cheering on King Ahab's doomed campaign at Ramoth-Gilead. They are refusing to prophesy to power when that power benefits their nationalistic theology.
Let's link this back one final time to that damning comparison of the personal versus the public standard, just like we saw in the moral case study.
The sources use the logic of suffering to expose the hypocrisy again, they argue. When Christians' own families needed Medicaid, they accepted the help. But when it is someone else's child under rubble, someone else's hunger, they immediately default to preaching about God's judgment and personal responsibility for that distant suffering.
And this, for them, is the proof.
It's the proof that the VR headset isn't just obscuring distant suffering. It is actively fueling the profound theological hypocrisy that prevents any true revival or repentance from ever taking place.
Okay, so the sources have systematically detailed how the church has been seduced by this flattering nationalist illusion, the VR headset, across its theology, its morality, its foreign policy. Now, we have to synthesize the fundamental identity crisis this has caused.
And that identity crisis is the ultimate choice that defines the entire critique. Is the American church an ambassador, or is it a court prophet?
Paul calls Christians Christ's ambassadors in 2 Corinthians 5. Let's go deeper on this. What does that ambassador role really imply, and how does it relate to the source's argument that the church has been so derailed by Christian nationalism?
Well, an ambassador is the representative of a foreign sovereign. Their loyalty is singular. It's to Christ the King. Their authority derives from the capital city, which is heaven, and their mission is to speak the king's truth to the host country, reminding that host country that it is a temporary subordinate power.
So the ambassador's job is inherently counternationalist.
It has to be, because the ambassador's loyalty is to the kingdom that is not of this world, as Jesus told Pilate. The church, in this role, should be the ultimate check and balance on the overreach of state power and national ambition.
And the court prophet is the total betrayal of that mission.
It's the functional opposite. The court prophet is embedded within the host power structure. They speak on behalf of the kingdom to the king. That is, they tell the existing earthly power exactly what it wants to hear. Their goal is not to challenge the national vision, but to consecrate it, to bless it.
And the sources argue that the core derailment of Christian nationalism is that it replaces the ambassador's king, who is Christ, with a nationalist agenda. It turns the church into a cheerleading section for Caesar rather than a spokesperson for Christ.
That's the argument in a nutshell.
The sources then use the case studies as this brutal summary of the church's failures as a court prophet. Let's recap those failures specifically in terms of this mission derailment.
Okay, first, the failure of moral courage. The church, acting as a court prophet, refuses to name the Epstein class corruption and moral rot at the heart of American power when that power is strategically beneficial to them. It chooses institutional silence over prophetic witness.
Second, the failure of compassion, which is driven by this theological bias.
Refusing to cry out for the children of Gaza with the same passion that was once reserved for other causes. And this, they argue, is driven directly by the Christian Zionist framework that equates the modern state with scriptural promises, blinding the church to the clear demands of Matthew 25.
And third, what they call the failure of vision.
Yes. Filling stadiums to declare America shall be saved and revival is here, while never ever mentioning the actual savagery, the poverty, the systemic injustice, the screaming reality that is carried out with American weapons and often financed by the tithes of the faithful. They're selling a comfortable fantasy vision of a biblical worldview that is, in fact, purely nationalist.
So the end result of adopting this court prophet role is that the church just becomes useless for its actual divine mission.
It has ceased to be salt and light and has become instead the whitewash on the wall, which is a reference to Ezekiel 13. It ceases to transform the world and instead becomes an anesthetic.
An aesthetic.
It dulls the moral pain of the status quo. It provides this beautiful high-production spiritual overlay, the VR headset, that leaves the underlying systemic hunger and injustice entirely unchanged. They are actively preventing true revival because they prefer the safety of the simulation to the uncomfortable demands of the screaming reality.
So the critique is that the church has traded prophetic truth for a comfortable illusion. If the task is not to curse America or conservatism, what is the prophetic call to action that's laid out in the source material? The ultimate goal, it seems, is recovery.
The sources are absolutely clear on this. The prophetic task is not judgment for judgment's sake. The task is to remove the headset. The goal is repentance and restitution, that ancient requirement to return what was stolen, free the captives, and break bread with the poor.
And this requires consciously substituting that comfortable peace message with the uncomfortable truth of reality.
Yes. It means recovering the language of lament and justice. The call is for the church to say, with Jeremiah, peace is not here. It is to say, with Amos, let justice roll down like waters, even when, especially when it implicates our own political alliances, our own foreign policy, and our own nationalism. It requires a deliberate, maybe agonizing acknowledgement that the virtual gardens they have built are totally irrelevant if children are eating dust just outside the walls.
The modern prophetic idiom the sources provide translates this ancient command into today's context, and it really emphasizes the material reality of the suffering.
It does. The sources summarize the prophetic call like this. Thus says the Lord to the metaverse makers, you have built virtual gardens while my children eat dust. Remove the headset from their eyes, break bread with the hungry, or the algorithm will crash and the servers will go dark.
Wow. That is a modern prophecy right there.
It's an insistence that until the bread is shared, until the material reality of the king's kingdom is demonstrated by care for the least of these, the vision of triumph is simply a nationalist lie.
The entire deep dive has hinged on this choice between the flattering nationalist simulation that has derailed the mission and the costly truths of the ambassador's mission. So what is the final analysis the sources offer regarding the historical judgment on the silent church?
The conclusion is stark. It serves as a direct warning to you, the listener. The sources state that history will not remember the silent as the faithful remnant who were quietly enduring the times. It will remember them as the priest who passed by on the other side of the road after seeing the bleeding man.
But with a modern technological twist.
A twist that compounds the failure. They say only this time they live streamed your worship song as you walk past the bleeding man and called it glory.
That is an incredibly potent and difficult final image. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you engage with this material? The sources insist that the way forward, the path to any true revival, is a conscious, painful, and immediate step.
Revival, according to these sources, does not come to people who prefer the simulation to the screens. It only comes when the uncomfortable truth is finally admitted, when the illusion of the winning nationalist project is identified as a theological failure, and the boy outside is finally fed. The only way the American church can recover its identity as Christ's ambassadors is by willingly choosing to prophesy to power rather than cheer for it.
So the analysis forces all of us to confront the choice between two fundamentally different spiritual realities: the easy digital affirmation of the status quo or the harsh material demands of the gospel.
It does. And the sources leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought, one that really demands a resolution. They say, take off the headset, or admit once and for all that you prefer the simulation to the Savior who is still hanging on the cross in every child you refuse to see. The antidote to the lies of Christian nationalism and these comforting illusions is a stubborn material insistence. Until the bread is shared, the nationalist vision is a lie. The path to recovery requires the church to cease being a court prophet and rediscover the costly material mission of the ambassador.